Well, thanks very much for having us here today. Quick introduction, she said. We're from Premier One. We're the IT managed service provider that takes care of a lot of the IT needs for the organization here, as we do for a lot of other companies. What they asked us to do was come up with a list of topics that might be interesting to their members, to the other insurance agencies out there that that may have IT needs that aren't being addressed, or maybe they don't know should be addressed. So we came up with a list of 4 topics that we're going to kind of brush over today. We'll give you some best practices, some stories about how they relate to business, and then we'll open it up to questions at the end. So if you do have questions, we'd ask that you maybe write them down so you don't forget them, and then at the end we'll open it up to questions. One of the things, my name is Jim, by the way. I'm one of the engineers at Premier One. One of the things that I kind of try to do when I'm teaching about technology is do it in the way that I learned. When I was a kid, my brother-in-law was my mentor, and he showed me neat things to do on computers. He showed me everything that was possible. And then he'd say, "You want to do this?" It was, I remember very specifically, we dialed up to a bulletin board and downloaded a game, and then we played it. And he played it, showed me how fun it was, and asked me if I wanted to do it. And I said, "Well, sure, of course, that looks like fun." So he deleted everything, got up, and walked away. And so what he did was he taught me what was possible and what the computer was capable of. And that led me to know what questions needed to be asked to figure out how to do it so I could play the game. So when I talk about technology and how it might apply to a business, I like to let people know what's possible, and then from there find out where their needs are and how those line up with the possibilities. So what we're going to do today is talk briefly about network security, malware protection, which is kind of a hot topic today. We're going to talk about compliance, a big deal in financial and retail industries, but we'll probably be expanding to probably every industry out there. We'll move on to talking about backup and disaster recovery, which can be done at every level, from the little single-man shop all the way to a large organization. And the last thing that we're going to talk about is internet access, different means of accessing the internet and things you can do to make sure that you've always got connectivity when you need it. So without further ado, I'm going to pass this off to Chris. Chris is one of the engineers, also the Director of Operations at Premier One, and he's going to talk about network security.
All right, thanks a lot, Jim. Like Jim said, my name is Chris, and I'm going to talk a little bit about network security and kind of how that pertains to possibly your organization or an organization like KI. Kind of want to start out with a little story that I like to tell. A couple years ago, March 2014, I believe, we get a call up on a Thursday morning, 8 a.m. We always love 8 a.m. calls. And frantic call. I can't open my files, and okay, there's 100 reasons why you can't open your files. Jump in, take a look. They say, I can see all my files, they're there. When I open them, it just looks like gibberish. And right then I knew what was going on, because we had been reading about this threat quite a bit. They had been hit with a form of ransomware called CryptoLocker, which you may have heard of in the news. What that did was they got infected with something, and ransomware scrambles up all your files, and the only way to unscramble them is with basically a password that only the bad guys know. And so that was the first time we had seen that really in the wild firsthand. And so it's an interesting story, because they were just like any other organization in town. They weren't a big organization like Target that got hit. They were just a common company that you might run into any day. So what happened with that, we diagnosed that that's what it was. It was some kind of ransomware, and then we needed to figure out how to recover from it. The way to typically recover from ransomware is to either pay the ransom or go to your backups and restore all your files from backups. And so, we asked them, does your IT provider have backups? And they said, oh yeah, we got backups. They're running on the server, and they get us logged in, and we take a look, and okay, there's backups, and we start going through the log. Failed. The backups had been failing for months, so they didn't really have backups. And so, of course, we had to have the tough conversation. Okay, alternative B is to pay the ransom. I suppose alternative C would be to deal without your files. So in the end, the company decided to pay the ransom. They did get their files back in the end, but it was a difficult process. They called us up Thursday morning. You had to go through a bunch of hoops to even pay the ransom. You had to go and purchase a gift card at a Walmart, and then upload that anonymously to these people, and then they release the key to unlock all your files. The whole process took a few days, so they actually had to shut down their business. They couldn't operate at all for 2 to 3 days. Finally got the ransom paid, unencrypted all their files. They were back to normal, but they saw firsthand what a failed level of network security could do to an organization of any size. And that's not the only time that we've ran into that either. Since that point, 2 years ago, we've assisted over half a dozen other companies out there that have run into the same situation. Some have been simple restores from backups. Others have decided to not pay the ransom and just lose their data and start over. And so that story is an interesting reminder that it doesn't matter what size of an organization you are, even if it's your home computer, that is a huge threat and risk that's out there. So as that pertains to network security, that's just one example where network security can be an issue. So what we like to do is not only look at network security as how do you prevent malware, but how do you prevent hackers from getting into your system and stealing confidential information, things like that. So the approach that we take at Premier One, and it's an industry best practice, is to layer your security for your computer network. And what that layering means is that you have basically different perimeters of defense for your network. And so I kind of want to talk about a few of those. Yeah, they're up here. So most security risks are pertaining to internet threats. I want to make clear that that's not the only threat, because you could have malicious people inside your organization, and that adds another bit of complexity. But this primarily focuses on internet threats, since it's probably the most widespread. So when we look at layering security, we start with where your internet connection comes into your business. And so usually you order a cable or a DSL or a fiber service, and you plug it into a firewall. And most of you would have some kind of firewall, but most aren't aware of what that really does. And so firewall systems that we use offer antivirus scanning at the entire network level. So any files that are downloaded into your network before they even come into your computer, that firewall is going to also scan everything, and if it finds that it's a virus or whatever, it'll block it from even getting inside your network. Unfortunately, with any kind of security, one mechanism is not sufficient to mitigate all risks or all threats. And so we can't assume that a firewall is going to block every kind of risk. Another layer then would be web filtering, and often this is done also at the firewall. And that's to block sites or categories of sites that aren't deemed appropriate for your business. And so a lot of times when people think about web filtering, they think about, maybe we want to block Facebook because it's a time killer in our organization. And that's an important piece, but it's also important to realize that web filtering can also block things like known malicious sites or sites that serve up malware. They try to get you to download malware files. In the example of this ransomware that reached this organization we helped with, we suspect that it came through email. And this organization did not have any email filtering, and that's actually one of the biggest ways that ransomware is spread is through email. And so in addition to having a firewall and in addition to having web filtering, it's important to filter all your emails that come into the organization. That's another channel that data from the outside world can come into your business. If all that fails, which it does occasionally, there's no single measure to stop 100% of threats. The next layer would be antivirus on each of your computers. And that's probably something most of you are familiar with. You probably hear it over and over. Make sure you put antivirus on your computer. And that's to catch anything that may make it through these other layers. Beyond that, another layer of security is not one that's thought about too much, but it's just looking at who's allowed to get access to your files, even within your organization. So that follows under authentication and authorization controls. Authentication being, do you have mechanisms in place to identify who each person is? So typically that's a username and a password. Authorization, on the other hand, is once you know who that user is, do they have permission to access certain files? In the case of this ransomware, their entire organization's data for their entire history of, I think, about 10 years was compromised because that individual that got infected had access to everything for the whole organization. If they had only had access to certain files that they needed, those are the only ones that would be affected. So it's important to have those controls in place. And finally, the last one is just user training and awareness. Just even what we're talking about today, being aware that these risks are out there, and technology can't catch 100% of every threat. And so at the end of the day, sometimes users have to make a choice as to whether to open a file or not. And that can be the difference as to whether their systems get infected or not. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kevin, who will talk about compliance.
Thanks, Chris. My name is Kevin Nincy-Elser. I have been at Premier One for a few years. Prior to that, I was a compliance analyst for a few years as well. So one of my responsibilities at Premier One is to ensure that we are in compliance with SSAE 16 SOC 2 standards. For those of you that don't know what that is, which included me until I started at Premier One, it's a set of standards that holds a company to best practices, specifically for us in the area of IT. So the ultimate purpose of this type of compliance is that when we tell our clients that we are doing something like taking backups for them or protecting their systems with firewall, with antivirus, not only can we say that we're doing that, but then a third party comes in, audits us to ensure that we are then doing that. So I just kind of wanted to talk about what the purpose of compliance is, especially as it relates to you guys. The trend in the industry, in many industries that Jim touched on, is moving toward a higher level of compliance. How many of you shopped at Target last year during Christmas and had to get a new credit card? I was one of them. Actually, I don't shop at Target, but my wife does. So that's just one example. There's, Home Depot's had data breaches. There have been breaches of Social Security numbers. All of this data exists somewhere. It's in databases on someone's server. It's in someone's server in the cloud. It's wherever it is vulnerable. to an extent. If a person has access to it, then it's vulnerable. So what we're seeing is that, especially in the financial industry, the standards for compliance are really starting to get dialed in. They're cranking down hard on making sure that systems are secure, that there are firewalls in place. Not just that there are firewalls in place, but that they have the correct configuration in order to actually protect the systems and the data that other people want access to and shouldn't have access to. So, and that's an important piece of compliance, is access to data. That's really at the core of what the purpose is for any compliance regulations. It's who has access to what. Do the correct people have access to the correct data? And does everyone else not have access to that data? So most of the compliance standards are written to some extent around that concept of making sure that data is only able to be accessed by those that need it. Chris kind of touched on some examples of how data can be compromised. And while it's important to understand how it can be compromised, it's also important to understand why it might be compromised. So in the case of a crypto locker, well, there's some organization out there that wants money. So they're willing to steal and encrypt your data in order to get money from you. But what happens when there's other nefarious organizations that want that data for other reasons? Bank account numbers, social security numbers, passwords, usernames. These are all things that are highly valuable to us individually. Therefore, they're also highly valuable to people that can exploit them. So it's important to understand, I think, why compliance is necessary. I'll share a little secret with you. As a former compliance analyst outside of Premier One, not even compliance analysts like compliance. But, and it's got a bad rap because you don't see any direct, correlation to the numbers at the bottom line. But sometimes what we say at Premier One is it's the things that don't happen that are just important as the things that do happen. And it's the same thing with compliance. Making sure that your organization is compliant with a set of best practices and standards ultimately will prevent a lot of bad things from happening. So I just wanted to kind of touch base on some hot topics here, some things that you all probably encounter on a regular basis. So who here has an iPhone or an iDevice that they use to access company data for your organization? Does anybody use that? You have, probably have email on your phone, right? And then who has like an Android device to do the same thing, a non-Apple device? Okay, so you all probably to some extent are using mobile computing to access data. There's an example just in the news recently, the San Bernardino case. For those of you that have not heard of that, basically there was a terrorist act and they recovered this terrorist's iPhone. The device, however, is encrypted so that data on it cannot be accessed without the user's permission. The user is disposed at this point, no longer available, so the FBI wants to have access to this data. Well, Apple, who has manufactured this device, says, we're not going to unlock it because if we unlocked it for one person, we could unlock it for other people. So mainly, this is an example of the idea that your devices can be encrypted. Basically, encryption just means that there's a really long, big, long password that's not something you can just remember. It's not like, football 22 or anything like that. It's a long series of characters that's long enough that even a computer wouldn't be able to guess it, given lots of time and resources. So iPhones, Apple devices are encrypted by default. Android devices are not. That's not to say that one is better than the other. What's important to note is that encryption is important. If you were to lose your phone, or you leave it at an event, someone else picks it up, takes it, steals it, whatever. Same with a laptop. Any mobile device that you're using to access your data, if it gets into the wrong hands, other people can use it to access your data too. So what would happen if those people accessed your data? Could they access your contact lists? Could they see your emails? Do you have you emailed yourself a password before? Have you emailed confidential information to your spouse or to one of your clients? This is all data that could be accessed if you misplaced your mobile device. So what's important to know when you participate in mobile computing or have a mobile device that has important information on it is that it's secure. It needs to be encrypted. It needs to have the ability to be locked or wiped if you were to lose it. And of course, Premier One does provide solutions to that, which is one of the reasons that we want to bring it up. But also email encryption. This is basically encrypting communications between one point and another. The intent is that people know that data contained within that email message cannot be read along the way to its destination. Also, we've had cases of email spoofing where someone sends an email from an email address similar to someone you know, and they ask, send me some money to this account. Well, we've had multiple business cases where there's been wire fraud associated with that, where people have sent money to offshore accounts and never see it again, simply because they didn't have any email encryption. Physical and logical access is another important topic in compliance. Basically, making sure that access is only granted to people that need it. Whether that's the way we have to buzz into this building. There are companies that don't have that type of system set up where somebody could walk in, pick up a server, walk out, and take all the data with them. If you use a hole-in-the-wall tax preparation service, look out for that, because a lot of times you can walk in and see the little server sitting behind the desk somewhere. Well, if you can see it, then someone else can walk in and steal it. It's a huge risk that no one really sees. Vulnerability assessment and penetration testing. This is just another function of compliance that we have a solution that we can offer. Basically, we have tools that will look at your system. It will test your system and make sure that things are tight and secure. It's basically we're going in and making sure that we can't break into it. Because if we can't, then hopefully other people can't as well. And then the last topic, change management, is basically if you're going to change access, if you're going to modify firewall settings, if you're going to change anything within your organization related to access, you document that so that if anything were to ever happen, you know where it went and what happened with it. I've run out of time, so I'm going to pass it along to Julie here to talk about backup and disaster recovery.
Hello, I'm Julie. I've been at Premier One for, I don't want to tell you how long time. I want to talk about backup and disaster recovery. It's kind of funny, right before I came over, I was talking to a lady on the phone. She had a POP account for her email. And she somehow mysteriously deleted her whole PST file. So 11,000 emails are gone. And so I am trying to figure out how, because she doesn't have a backup, because it's saved on her local machine. And so I got to figure out how I'm going to get these 11,000 emails back. So it's very important to have not only your servers backed up, but if you're doing something like that, for example, email stored locally on your machine, you might want to look at a solution to back up your local workstations. You could do that on-site, off-site. There's a lot of things about backing up to the cloud nowadays. The only thing about backing up to the cloud is do a lot of research on that. Make sure you know where that's going. So if, for example, if something like this happens, you can restore it very quickly. You can do both. A lot of people do on-site and off-site. That way, you don't have so much downtime with trying to figure out how to pull it back down, especially if it's very large. There's also a lot of our clients have local applications. We have one particular client that has their software is not really a very high standard software. It seems like every other time we do an update to it, we have to end up rolling it back. So with the backup software that we use, it's very easy because we can just go back to whatever the time was that was the good one and pull it back in, and it works very well. There's a lot of different backup scenarios you could do. Like you could back up through a backup software that it's only as good as what you tell it to. So then if you change something on your machine, then you have to go back in and tell it, okay, now I've changed this, so I got to go back in and change my backup file. We do it basically takes an image of your server, or your workstation, either or. So it does a snapshot of your machine, and then we've got a couple different backup softwares. One does it every, you could tell it to do it 3 times a day. We have another one that every time a file is changed, that it does a new backup of that as well. So the endpoint backup is the backup of the local workstation. And so I would highly recommend that, especially for if you have mobile devices, to use some sort of backup software for those. They get stolen, they get destroyed in a disaster, or if you spill coffee on it, then it destroys your workstation. The server-based backup, like Chris talked about, the Encrypto Locker, that was a great example of why you really want to test your backups. They obviously thought they were covered, and when they went back, they weren't. So always make sure, test them, restore them, make sure that your backups are working correctly before a situation happens and you find out that it's not any good anymore. So image-based versus file backup-based. The image-based is, like I said, it just takes a snapshot of your workstation or your server as often as you want it to. The file-based is, like I said, only as good as what you tell it to. There's off-site and on-site backups. Always make sure whatever kind of device, if you do on-site, make sure that you have it redundant. So you can do just like a little USB drive. The only thing about those is a lot of times they go out and then you're kind of up a creek again. So a lot of times they have like backup drives that are redundant. So you have 2 drives in the server, and so like if one of the drives goes out, it's not a big deal. It's hot swappable. You can throw the other drive in, and you don't even notice anything's wrong, and you haven't lost any backups either. So I guess basically all I'm really saying is just do a lot of research on whatever backup program that you've decided and test them. So that's it. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Jim.
All right, so the last topic we're going to go over here is regarding internet access, and I guess kind of the importance of different technologies around internet access. So most people are probably, every one of your offices has internet, yes? Depending on where you live and who your telephone company is, will determine what kind of internet access you have. If you live in a place that has multiple options for types of internet, like here in the city of Topeka, you can get AT&T. They offer fiber optic, DSL, either of those two types of internet. But then there's also Cox cable, so you can get cable for your internet. And there are different qualities of all these different types of internet that you may need to take into account when you're determining what's best for your business. If you live in rural Kansas, you might be lucky enough to have a independent telephone company as your provider, and oftentimes they provide more cutting-edge solutions. I come from St. Mary's Wamego area, and out there where we have Wamego Telephone, we get fiber optic. We've had fiber optic internet available since 2003. Now, it wasn't until much later, 5 or 6 years later, that people started talking about Google Fiber, and that set the industry on fire. And little old Wamego Telephone had been doing that since '03. Real quick, kind of to go over some of the differences, fiber optic internet gives you very high speed connection to the internet, not only as far as how much you can download, how fast you can download, but also the time that it takes for packets to get back and forth. There's, I guess I'll start here. There are two types of measurements of speed on the internet. There's bandwidth and latency. And if you're just downloading files, you're going to be really concerned just with your bandwidth. But if you're going to do any kind of voice over IP, whether you're doing Google Hangouts or Skype, or if you use Vonage for your telephones, something like that, you want to use an internet connection that has a lower latency value. So an example of that would be how long it takes a packet to get from your computer to, let's say, the Skype server and back. Okay, so if you're doing a Skype call with somebody and you have very high latency and it takes a long time for packets to get from your computer out to Skype and back, that's going to make the call choppy and hard to deal with. If you're only worried about downloading big files and how fast files come down, then you could get away with a connection that isn't so focused on better latency but higher bandwidth. So different types of internet technologies. DSL right now is kind of the low man on the totem pole. Typically it's a little higher latency, and the bandwidth lets you download files at an okay rate, so it's not super fast for download, but it's not terrible. But the upload speed, so if you're sending files, like if you're sending an email with a big picture or lots of attachments, that will take a lot longer on DSL because their upload speeds are traditionally slower. Cable modem is a lot like DSL in that they have different rates of speed for their downloads and their uploads, but typically they're just a lot faster. So cable download is typically way faster than any DSL connection, and their upload also, it's still, their upload is slower than their download. So if you're sending big files on cable modem, it would be faster than if you were doing it on DSL, but still not as fast as if you're doing it on fiber. So we get to fiber, which is the end all right now, and basically that means that you get super fast speeds as far as latency is concerned. So voice over IP calls are always very clear. Any kind of video conferencing you might be doing is fantastic. And your upload speeds and your download speeds are often the same, depending on who your provider is. And even if by default the provider still sells you fiber where the upload speed is slower, more often than not, they have the ability to increase that upload speed. Fiber allows it to be as fast as they want to give you access to. The other two technologies, cable and DSL, the technology does not allow for high upload speeds. It's just not a possibility. And then kind of the last way that people are getting internet access these days, it's kind of maybe a last-ditch effort, is through the cell providers. You hear about LTE modems. You can, if you live in an area that just isn't served by a telephone company. If you're far enough away from the telephone company, maybe there's just no way for you to get internet from them. If you have cell coverage, you can get a little, they call it a LTE modem. And you can use those, but the problem is that they bill you based on how much you use it. Most ISPs don't do that. They just give you, here's your connection, it's this fast, use it, have fun. With cell providers, you know, they have these data caps. If you use more than a certain amount of data, they start billing you more. It's metered. But depending on how critical your internet connection is to your business, you may also consider using LTE as a backup to your primary internet connection. So I guess there's a lot of companies that have their services hosted out in the cloud or hosted by a larger organization. So if I understand things correctly, you are a bunch of independent insurance agents, correct? And so you're dealing with all these other bigger companies, probably getting on their websites to get quotes. And if you've got a client sitting at your desk and your telephone company's internet connection just tanked, what do? You know, do you tell the client to come back later? And I'm not even sure if it's that common anymore for people to come in and sit down and talk to you. I would imagine in small towns that's more a thing still. But even if you're on the phone with them, if your internet connection goes down, it's really no fun for anybody. So depending on how critical that is, you may decide to spend a little bit extra money per month, and in the case of your primary internet connection failing, it automatically switches over to the secondary type of connection. Most places don't have the option to have two land-based internet providers. Topeka, we've got AT&T and Cox. Like in rural Pot County, it's just Wamego Telephone. There's not a second provider. So depending on where you are, you might be able to get an internet connection from two companies, and if one fails, it automatically switches over to the other. In the place where you don't have a second land-based ISP, you could have LTE or cell data as your backup. And anytime your main internet provider goes down, seamlessly switches over, and then when your main internet connection comes back, it switches back. Nobody's the wiser. But if you use it too much, again, when you're on the cell service, you might end up running a little bit bigger of a bill. But I think most of those carriers have ways to alert you when you get towards usage situations. So I've done a lot of work in the retail industry where it is vitally important that they're able to have internet access. They use it for credit card processing. And so we deployed this solution where should their main internet connection die, it automatically switches over to LTE. And what would happen more frequently than not, prior to putting this solution in, you'd walk up to this convenience store and there'd be a sign on the door that says, sorry, we can't take credit cards. 9 times out of 10, if you ever see that happens, that means the internet's down. When we switched to this other system that used LTE as the backup, those signs just didn't get used anymore. So it's a pretty good situation. You know, in the case of trying to deliver quotes to your customers, that might be good to not have to make them wait, give them an opportunity to get online and look for other solutions, what have you. And then the other and last point to do with internet connectivity is if you're a big enough organization where you do have multiple sites, sometimes it's nice for the 2 sites or more than 2 sites to be able to communicate with each other. We as a managed service provider kind of specialize in multi-site connectivity, so we have several customers that have 10, 20 sites, and they're all able to communicate over the internet in a secure fashion. We manage their internet connections, the encryption of them and everything, and it just kind of works pretty nicely. It makes the whole way that they do business just a little more efficient. So those are things that are possible. I guess when it comes to everything that we've talked about, I hope that you've heard about some things that are possible that maybe you didn't know about, or maybe things that brought up some questions you might have about things you already did know about. Clearly, we are always glad to take on new business, but most importantly, if you've got needs like this and you've got somebody that you trust, use somebody to make sure that everything that you're doing is doing what you expect it to. Backups, you know, you have to test them, you have to make sure they work. Antivirus, layered security, it's super important. And then while it's not required for the industry that you're in today, but I know that they're working on it, this compliance thing, eventually it's going to get to the point where, you know, you're going to be required to protect your customers' information in some way and prove that you are by following some sort of compliance standard. So with that, kind of wrap up, we'll open it up to questions. If anybody has any questions, you can direct it to any one of us. Anything that is, you know, really very specific to your business, you know, maybe you don't want to talk about that in front of everybody, that's fine, we can do that later. If you have generic questions, whatever you like. So.
I have 2 questions.
Yes, sir.
Recommended virus protection program and any way to increase the number of the current provider that the guy has. Is there any options for them?
Can you repeat his question?
Yes, so the question was, do we have a recommended internet or antivirus solution? And the other question, is there a way to increase your upload speed? We'll start with the internet connection because I have the mic, and then I'll hand it over to Chris on the antivirus one. So you have to call your ISP and just ask and beg and plead. And a lot of times, where do you live, or where is this connection? I'm sorry?
Lynn, we have CenturyLink.
Okay, so CenturyLink is notoriously slow in adopting new technologies, especially in the rural areas. I'd encourage anybody who's interested in any of this kind of discussion to look at a particular website, ntca.org. It talks about independent telephone companies and the struggles they're fighting, where the big organizations are taking all the money from the rural areas, shoving it into the big cities and ignoring rural towns. But the idea there is that in CenturyLink towns, I'm going to say you're probably not going to have much luck increasing your upload speed without spending a ton of money. I have one customer in St. Mary's who uses Wamego Telephone for their primary and wanted to get CenturyLink for their backup. And CenturyLink, again, they've had this competition since 2003 with the fiber, and still today it costs to get a 20 meg pipe from CenturyLink. It costs over $1,000 a month instead of $100 for 100 meg at Wamego Telephone. So CenturyLink, probably not going to, but it doesn't hurt to ask. And the more you ask,
I have asked, and they told me no, but I thought I'd ask you.
yeah. So, long story short, yeah, probably not. So,
Yep. As to the antivirus, so we utilize a certain application. We use Symantec Endpoint Protection, which is an enterprise solution. However, what I always say on antivirus is it's probably not your most important piece of your network security. And antivirus is traditionally not so effective that you need to rely solely on that. So before I usually have the antivirus discussion, I want to discuss all the other layers of security. In the end, there's a lot of good solutions. There's Kaspersky, there's Webroot, there's Symantec. We don't really recommend McAfee, but it really comes down to the configuration of that application, and does it have reporting and alerting to let you know when there's issues.
yes, sir.
If we have a cloud-based system, for example, our agency management system or our email is based on a remote server by a remote company, a cloud-based scenario, is there anything in particular we need to worry about that? Because the offsite provider should have quite a bit of security on their end. Am I incorrect in that?
That is correct. So the question is, if you have a cloud-based service that you rely on, for example, email or even your agency management software, things like that, what is there anything you need to worry about? A lot of cloud-based software, maybe not email, but maybe I'm thinking about some organizational management software that I've seen that's cloud-based, will let you export your data. And so that might not be a bad practice to get into, just to make sure that your data is backed up yourself. Most likely they do have solutions in place, and a lot of these bigger organizations probably have your data spread across multiple data centers in multiple cities. But really, you would probably want to ask. And if they're at that level of providing the kind of services you're talking about, they are probably doing some sort of compliance like we talked about earlier, like the SOC 2 compliance. You could ask them if they are SOC 2 compliant, and if they are, look at their policies and procedures. That should all be outlined, and you can find that out. So really, it's just a matter of asking them to see what they do, and if you have the possibility to take some of that on yourself, just export your data on a regular basis. Did that answer your question okay?
Yes, sir.
All right. Yes, ma'am.
Can you speak to having your computer systems monitored or checked to see if there is, I don't know what it's called, but there's something laying in there that will at a future date start to steal your data or do that? How do you know that stuff's out there and how can you protect yourself from that?
So the software, the question is, how do you, what is the software used to check to see if there's bad software on your computer that will at some later date affect you in a bad way? So that would be your antivirus software solution. And most of those will look at every file on your computer and analyze it on a regular basis. Usually there's a daily scan that just looks at everything, and if it sees anything out of place, it will let you know. It will alert you that it's there. Typically it will quarantine it. But it's important that that kind of software is updated on a regular basis. Not just there are definitions that are released many times a day that describe new bad software that's been discovered, but there's also the engines, the software itself that run the scans, that if it's out of date far enough, it can't detect some of the newer threats. So what you're looking for is a good antivirus solution. And the key there is know what you have and keep it up to date.
And I can kind of touch a little bit more on another aspect of that. Your firewall at your network level could be another layer. We talk about threats coming in. Your firewall can also analyze any data that's going out. So say that your antivirus still doesn't catch something that is on your computer that will do something at a later date. When that later date comes, your firewall could potentially analyze any data that's leaving your computer and sending up to the internet, and it may actually be able to block that outgoing information stream as well.
I just want to kind of bring a real-life example about that. We did have a client that was infected with a CryptoLocker type virus. But the way these particular viruses work is once the endpoint, the workstation, is infected, it has to report back to a server out on the World Wide Web somewhere to say, okay, here's the information that we can start encrypting. Because this client had a WatchGuard firewall that we had implemented, that CryptoLocker virus never was able to get outside of that internal network. So even though it was infected, nothing actually happened. It was basically stopped before it got outside of the network. So that firewall really saved them from all of their data being encrypted just by having that piece in place. So definitely that layered security, I just want to give you a real example of why that's so important.
I have a question on the password generator software.
Yes, sir.
Are they worth the price?
Well, so our password generator is password generator software worth the trouble. One of the biggest challenges that we have, all of us have, as far as security on everything to do with the internet is our identity, our accounts, and that's all really secured by the usernames and passwords that we choose. If you use a simple password, it's just so easy for people, for software, for computers to guess it. And so what the software does that does password generation is it makes these really hairy, long, nasty-looking passwords that you're never going to remember. But it also stores that for you in a secure way so that every time you go to a website, you may have to go look up your password to get on that website, but nobody out there is going to ever guess that password. So that's one thing. It's a little bit of a pain in the neck. Some software, for example, I use a piece of software called 1Password. And every time I create an account online, I have it generate a long password for me, and then I save it in the software. If I ever want to go back to this website, all I have to do is open 1Password, go to the website, click on a link, it pops up that website, fills in my password for me, and then gets me on. So it's really not much trouble for me, but in order for me to get into the database to get access to my passwords, I have to know my username and password, and I have to use what's called a token. I get a text on my cell phone that I then, after I put in my username and password, the system sends me a text, and then I have to take this generic or this random number that was generated and type it into the software, and then it lets me in. So I have to know something. I have to know my username and password, and I have to have something, physical access to my cell phone. And so this is called multi-factor authentication. You have two ways that you authenticate yourself, what you have and what you know. A lot of websites go into that. Your banks probably do that. You probably see on a lot of banks, they make you pick a picture and a phrase. And when you go to log into your bank website, if that's not your picture and your phrase, they tell you don't log in. That's a form of multi-factor. You know what your picture and phrase is supposed to be, and you know your username and password. That stops you from logging into websites that aren't your banks. Did that answer you? Okay. We're done? Okay. Any other questions? You'll have our contact information. Feel free to contact us. Thank you again very much for your time. We'll stick around a little bit after if anybody's got any other